First off, tell us a little bit about yourself.
My name is Devin Jerome Crawford. I currently serve as the staff director of the William Monroe Trotter Collaborative for Social Justice at the Harvard Kennedy School, Minister for Social Justice at the historic Myrtle Baptist Church in West Newton, Massachusetts. I'm originally from Birmingham, Alabama, which is really where much of my advocacy and identity as an activist really began. So activist at the academy and the church are where I find my um, my identity these days.
What have you worked on? What projects have you done? What are you really fighting for?
Currently, in this role as a staff director of the Trotter Collaborative, we're working on twin pandemics of COVID-19 and police brutality.
So next question. What do you think about the prison slash correctional systems today? And if you could also give a brief description of what it looks like today.
The the criminal legal system, it looks like, well, I think immediately of Michelle Alexander's pivotal work, The New Jim Crow, and thinking about the ways that the criminal legal system places folks within a caste that excludes them, discriminates against them because of a scarlet letter, a letter of being a criminal that's been placed on them. So it looks like people not having access to fair housing. It looks like people not having access to Pell Grants and loans to go to school and achieve higher education. You know, what we see as far as having 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the world's prison population, this disproportionate incarceration, captivity of bodies, disproportionately black and brown bodies. That does not correct, it does not reform, but rather it isolates, it strips people of their humanity and objectifies them as mere tools of labor, as cogs in an American empire. I think it's this new iteration of what chattel slavery, mass incarceration exists because of the loophole in the 13th Amendment, which allows for slavery if a crime has been committed. And so what we're seeing is this legalized form of punishment that is excessive, that is inhumane, and that really strips at the soul of who we are. It's one of the main engines of what this capitalist society depends upon, providing cheap labor to build its cities, to build its infrastructure. Coming from Alabama, I know personally about the ways that the prison system, the criminal legal system, exploits the labor of those, especially in the South. When you look at a company named U.S. Steel in Alabama, it's this huge company that was credited with helping to build Birmingham as quickly as it was built. You know, they call Birmingham the Magic City in the South. And that's because it grew faster than Charlotte, Atlanta, all these things before Atlanta got the big airport and all that. But that was, you know, in part because of all the citizens, the incarcerated citizens, whose labor was, you know, taken by U.S. Steel. There was a, you know, partnership between Alabama prisons and U.S. Steel to, you know, use the cheap labor of prisoners to build Birmingham, to build the city. And so, like, you know, when I'm going through my hometown, I'm acknowledging that this was a city built on stolen land with stolen labor. This criminal legal system, this criminal punishment system, or legal punishment system, is really a matrix or a continuum of punishment and violence. So you see, like, you know, the parents that are interacting with the system, it's stolen their lives, but you also have children who may not necessarily be incarcerated, but they're still interacting with the system, going in, visiting their parents, interacting with court systems, working with appeals courts. And so it's this elegant matrix of culturally produced evils that get the whole family caught up. It's a wide network of violence that we're fighting, which can be abolished if we take these conversations about abolition seriously.
So I know you said that we make up 5% of the world's population and 25% of the prison population. Do you think that's part of the 13th Amendment loophole that you talked about?
I think so. I think that it gives our government or states like the legal precedent to incarcerate without any major checks and balances. I mean, that's the first part of it. You know, this is a whole lot of other public policy that came after, you know, the Reconstruction Amendments, the black codes and peonage and vagrancy laws, to the war on drugs. I think those were catalysts to exploit that 13th Amendment loophole. I do trace our current predicament, having this vast prison population, to our constitutional amendment, which allows for like the dehumanization and objectification of humans if they are incarcerated, if their bodies are in prison.
What fundamental aspects of the prison system do you think need to change in order to get away from this idea of slavery?
Prison for profit has really eroded the consciousness and really the legitimacy of the institution of criminal justice. So we'll go back to peonage. So peonage, is this idea of people who are incarcerated to pay off a debt. And we saw this in the form of, again, in the South, sharecroppers. I have family from Georgia who were sharecroppers who would tend to land that they did not own, a means to kind of forgive some kind of debt. Currently, we see this with cash bail, where people are wasting away in jail for a year, 2 years at a time, maybe more, not because they are convicted of a crime, but because they've been arrested and they can't pay their fines and fees. I was interacting with 16, 17-year-olds who were in jail for years because they couldn't pay their fines and fees. So I think that that's one major piece where we're incarcerating people for being poor, incarcerating people because they can't prioritize bail, fines, and fees. There's a lot of things I would change, but this issue of bail, fines, and fees, that's something that we can target now, working to appeal to consciousness, but also to get hard policy on the books to end what we know as debtors' prisons and these private prisons that really put at the center profit instead of people. Ending the cash bail system would allow folks who otherwise are already trapped in an abysmal economic system a chance to have some fair representation, to have an opportunity to continue to live their life outside of the surveillance of the state. I think it's a matter of having the right kind of pressure applied, and this is where like nonviolent direct action, civil disobedience comes into play, to push those who are in power to accept or come to the table as it concerns your policy agenda. Yeah, I think advocating within the judge's realm could be extremely critical and transformative when it comes to the legal punishment system.
I heard you bring up the death penalty, and in the last 2 days, we've heard about two black men who have been executed. And one of them was for a crime that was from when they were 18, and they were just an accomplice. I wanted to just know your opinion on that.
Yeah, I think that the death penalty has it certainly needs to be abolished. It's proven more times than not that it is an anti-black mechanism of the legal punishment system. When you think of all the black people that have been subject to the death penalty, it's largely a tool to hurt us. I remember, and it's unconscionable. It's like it's like this asymmetrical. There's an asymmetry of responsibility with the state as it pertains to conflict when it comes to resolution, in that they reserve this right to kill those whom they deem a threat. The moral exemption of the state from being judged when they kill people, which hasn't been questioned long enough or hard enough, I don't think. In 2011, my first semester at Morehouse, I was on a bus with a cohort of about 200, 308 students from Morehouse, Spelman, and Clark. And we're heading to Jackson, Georgia to protest the death of Troy Davis. Troy Davis, he was accused of murder in Savannah, Georgia in, I believe, 1993. Had been incarcerated for all those years. And September 2011 was the scheduled date to execute Troy Davis. And you had all these people, and we held up outside of the prison for about 5 or 6 hours. And we were met, a bunch of college students. Mind you, I'm a freshman from Alabama doing this. We're met with a line of state officers and police officers with full riot gear and shields and helmets, all that. I don't even think I had a pencil or a pen or, a pad or anything like that. I just had a cell phone. We weren't armed or anything. But the kind of force that we're met with to protest the death penalty in Georgia. Went all night. They requested a stay from the Supreme Court. And by the time we got back to Morehouse, because we thought that they were going to hold off, they decided not to and executed him that night. That was the first time I was just confronted with this unvarnished display of malfeasance, this is miscarriage of justice. When you consider all these stories that were recounted, when you consider all the people who were protesting, not only in the United States and in Georgia, but across the country, the voices of the people it still wasn't enough to move the mechanisms of this prison system. It was disheartening to say the least. It's those moments when you kind of see, like, even when there's reasonable doubt, folks will still use this power. And you have to ask the question, why? Is it just because they have the power? Is it because they do these things because they have the power to do so? When you have institutions like that just work with such unvarnished power to kill largely Black people, you can't consider that an ethical or moral tool of the state. I think we need to abolish it. I think that we need to reconsider how we think about reparative justice in this country.
What do we as a community in America need to do to sort of implement these changes or even work towards these goals?
A couple things, though. You have to continue to have this hermeneutic of suspicion around institutions that we've known to be staples. So hermeneutic is just asking questions. What you're doing right now, ask questions of what we've been taught is normal. Question what's been normalized and engage in a form of popular education that conscientizes people to reimagine what a new moral standard could be. What we've seen with other public campaigns to end mass incarceration, what we've seen with Michelle Alexander's book, pulling back the curtains of a mechanism of a system that feeds off of Black bodies. I think that we have to, engage not only in protest, but also in public policy. So that means that we have to, when you engage in nonviolent direct action, part of that is negotiation. There's a constant need to negotiate and push internally and externally. So like the same questions that we ask of people in power, we have to ask those of people in our community to help, further expand the moral imagination of what could be. I think one of the critical things is to be a proximate leader in all of this. Meaning if you want to, change the system, get to know the people that are impacted by the system. And there's a whole lot of people that are arrested directly in the system, in the cells, but there are also people that are like second order, third order impacted, so like children, wives, parents. It's the stories of the people that are directly impacted that will give you a lot of momentum, a lot of momentum. It's like finding different ways to make a compelling moral argument in order to further your agenda. Popular education, having this hermeneutic of suspicion, and being proximate leaders to those who are directly impacted are some direct ways that you can get involved and make some change. Connecting protest to public policy.
Can you just start with telling us a little bit about yourself?
Tanya Tucker. I live and work out of Washington, D.C., and have spent most of my career focused on equity and social justice issues. A big part of that focused on children and youth issues and how do you create the conditions around the country so that every young person can succeed and thrive. And for the past couple of years have been working with a social justice organization that is focused on how do we make sure everybody in this country has a fair shot at well-being. And so how do we sort of reimagine and transform all the different systems in the country to make that so. So everything from our justice system to education to child welfare, employment, all of that. How do we make our systems more fair in this country?
What is your personal opinion about the prison/correctional systems today?
I think we can actually draw a direct line from slavery all the way through today with our correctional system. I think it's just present day way of reinforcing inequity in this country. And so when you look at that system and see that most likely it's Black and brown people who get charged, who get sentenced and incarcerated at a rate that's like triple white people in this country. That's not a random thing. So I think the system itself is pretty inequitable and is just another way for the country to keep particularly Black people oppressed.
In what ways do you think that prison reinstates the idea of slavery?
So I think, I mean, if we think about slavery, right, it was legal, right? That was the law of the land 400 years ago. And so when that was abolished, the way white people thought about black people didn't actually change. So yes, you got rid of legal slavery, but the way people thought about black people didn't change. So all they did was enact other systems to continue to oppress black people. That's how you got the Jim Crow laws and segregation. And so then when that was abolished, you got redlining and black people couldn't, buy homes. And then when that was abolished, you saw, particularly like in the 70s and 80s, huge increases in who got incarcerated, and that sort of started the mass incarceration movement. So to me, it's just another sort of legal system that keeps black people oppressed and gaining any kind of, economic foothold. And the way that the system is enforced has such a disproportionate impact on communities of color, because even once you've, been incarcerated and, let's say you've been rehabilitated and done your time, you still come out with so many policies and regulations that make it hard for you to do anything. It makes it hard for you to get a job. Makes it hard to get housing, to get specific, there are like professional certifications that you can't get if you have a record, and so on and so on. And so it's almost like you do your time, but yet you're never able to kind of overcome that stigma of being incarcerated.
So I know that the crime bill was like one of those things that was used in mass incarceration, and you mentioned that how certain things are used against black people more. Do you think that connects more to slavery?
Yeah, because I think particularly the country wanted to keep sort of its control over black people. So you immediately saw almost sort of the invention of modern day policing, and, the prison system started to take root and take place right after slavery ended, because they needed another way to force black people to work. So it's like, okay, the prison system started to take root and take place right after slavery ended. We can't enslave them anymore, but we can arrest them and then actually make them work as part of the prison system. And that's where you got that loophole in the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery, but also had that line in there about, well, and except for places where you have committed an unlawful act. So that was the out to like, okay, and that's where you saw like chain gangs, and, even to this day, prisoners are used for labor and work for like pennies a day because it's legal.
Just a quick side current event. In the last 5 days, there have been two black men that have been executed, and I don't have enough information about one of them, but one of them I do know was at the time he was 18, and he was not part of it necessarily. He was simply an accomplice. If we could just get your opinion on that, that would be nice.
So I think, the fact that certainly federal executions have not taken place in quite some time, and one of those gentlemen was 18, I believe, at the time that all of it took place, and he wasn't the one who actually shot the people and killed them. And I don't think it's a coincidence that I think there are 5 people who are scheduled to be executed before Biden is inaugurated, and I believe 4 out of the 5 are African American men. And so, all the data shows that black people, black men in particular, are sentenced harsher, are on death row at a much more prevalent rate than white people. And even in cases where particularly you've done something as a teenager, sort of the trend is to really look at those cases now and reduce sentences, or at the very least, commute that from a death penalty to life in prison, particularly since it was committed at such a young age. So I think the rush to follow through on those executions and the unwillingness for the courts to step in, I think is just another symptom of, systemic racism in the country.
Do you think that the death penalty has a relation to race? Is there like a big jump in black men or black people getting the death penalty versus white Americans?
Definitely. I mean, if you look at the data, we get harsher sentences. We get sentenced to death more often than our white counterparts. And I think a big part of that is also the connection of economics to the justice system. So white people who have the means get really fancy, great lawyers, and black people who don't have the means get, court-appointed attorneys. Not that they're like awful, but it's just the fact that the more money you have, the more likely it is you can almost sort of, buy your way out of the justice system.
What fundamental aspects of the prison system do you think need to change in order to get rid of this idea of it being in relation to slavery?
So a couple things. One, I think we need to actually abolish and totally get rid of youth prisons, which is actually starting to happen around the country. I just think if you do something and you're 13, 14, 15, 16, that there are better and other ways to address that than actually locking, kids up in a prison system. I think there are like community alternatives and community programs that work much better than sending kids away to jail. I think we need to get rid of the like cash bail and bond system because there are so many. I just read something like maybe a couple of weeks ago where there are so many people in prison just because they couldn't pay a fine or, they couldn't actually pay their bail. So they've got to go to prison to even await their court case. And if you think about everybody is innocent until proven guilty, well, not if I have to actually spend 2 years in jail while I'm just waiting for my court case to come up and for a jury to say I'm innocent. Whereas obviously, white people and people who have the means to pay just don't have to do that, and they get to, stay in their communities and their homes. So I think that's a piece. And then I think we have to just get rid of this myth that the prison system is actually set up to rehabilitate people, because it's not. It's just set up to punish people. And if we really wanted to rehabilitate, we'd actually have more programs. People could get education and get skills for certain jobs. They could get therapy and mental health programs and services if we really were about rehabilitating people. And then I think there are all of these laws and policies and regulations for when people do actually get out of prison and re-enter communities that then just make it way too hard for them to stay out of trouble to succeed. Because if I can't find a job because every application asks, right, do I have a criminal record, or I'm not able to qualify for certain, housing because of my record. All of those kinds of regulations that go across different systems, if we got rid of those, barriers for people and actually supported them re-entering society and being able to support themselves, then we wouldn't see, I think, the recidivism rate that we see.
So you spoke about fines and bail and stuff like that. Do you think if we were to lower fines or lower bail so people can get out, if that would help a lot, or do you think that's like a small step?
I think it would actually help a lot. I mean, when you look at the fine, if you look at how many people get locked up just because they can't pay like traffic violations. I mean, that, yeah, people should obey the traffic laws. And yeah, if you get a speeding ticket, you should pay. But if those things accumulate, I don't think the right response is somebody has to go to prison. Like that just doesn't make sense to me. There has to be, other ways. So I think reducing fines, figuring out alternatives to bail, particularly when so many people can't afford it, and then they're just sort of sitting, kind of rotting away in prison, waiting for court dates. So, I don't know if it's you have to check in with like a certain program or something on a regular, basis, but I just think there have to be some other alternatives. And I think reducing the amount of money that the system costs would make a huge difference, because the reality in this country is that will disproportionately affect people of color, because we have not been able to sort of accumulate the same wealth that white people have in this country.
Do you think that there is anything specifically that we can do to like sort of like a different idea of bail to get out of jail in a way?
I think involving like some of the community organizations and community advocates, so that it isn't just like a family that's, bearing the cost of bail, but it's almost sort of a community coming together to say like, okay, we're vouching for this person. We're going to make sure this person, shows up for hearings and things like that. And these are sort of trusted and respected, either community advocates or community programs, that are also getting involved. And then if something, does happen, maybe it's funding or something that like the organization is taking on, as opposed to sort of the individual and their family having to come out of their pockets. But sort of the community coming together to say, okay, together we're supporting this person, and we're going to make sure that they go through the process. And then maybe, cash bail isn't something that has to even be put up, and people don't have to potentially lose their houses and all sorts of things that they put up for bail and bond.
First off, just tell us a little bit about yourself, sort of what you do.
Yeah, so I'm a professor at the Harvard Law School. I teach primarily in the areas of criminal law and criminal procedure and trial practice. And in addition to teaching at Harvard, I also practice. So I represent clients usually who are in really serious criminal jeopardy, either at the trial level or the appellate level.
The first question, what do you think about the prison or correctional systems today?
Well, the prison system or the prison industrial complex, I think, is in utter and complete disarray. We in the United States incarcerate people at absolutely alarming levels. We use the criminal law to solve a whole host of problems that go far beyond what the criminal law is designed to redress. Instead, we put people in jail as a function of poverty and undereducation and mental illness and a host of factors that would be better dealt with in other areas. So I guess in short, prison industrial complex is a reflection of the poor way in which we deal with and understand the criminal law in this country.
In what ways does the prison system reinstitute slavery, or like the idea of it, I guess?
Well, that's actually a great question. One of the things we know about slavery and then Jim Crow America, which followed slavery, is that it constrained black bodies, it constrained movement. During slavery, these black bodies were constrained in very explicit ways. You were told what time to wake up, what to do, when you could eat, when you could sleep, when you could procreate even. I mean, every aspect of your life was wholly controlled by the people who purported to own other human beings. And then in Jim Crow, there were other less explicit constraints, but where you could live, where and how you could be educated, where you could work. These sorts of things were severely constrained. And so there was this long history of controlling black bodies in America. And that's why in the 50s and 60s, when black folks started marching, it was such a completely rebellious act, because there have been this long history in this country of complete control of black bodies. And here are all these black bodies marching against the law. And in your generation, you too have seen now the power of marching, where police have been controlling black bodies in certain neighborhoods in particularly brutal sorts of ways. And then you had all these people, and in the wake of George Floyd, it was multiracial and multi-generational, who were out there moving and marching and protesting. So the prison system, in the same way, controls black bodies. It indisposes these bodies, takes people out of families, takes people out of work, and is an extraordinarily disruptive. It takes an extraordinarily disruptive toll in communities. So we incarcerate in the United States greater than any country in the world, and black and brown people are disproportionately incarcerated. So the detriments that flow from incarceration are most acutely felt in communities of color.
You spoke a little bit about we incarcerate people at like a really high rate. Do you think that has to do with like the 13th Amendment loophole, with slavery being like a answer if you get into trouble with the law?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I've heard the argument. I've heard people speculate about the 13th Amendment as a ground to re-enslave people, and there's no real history around that clause, and maybe one or two cases where a court has ever looked at that clause. It's an interesting question, interesting intellectual question, but I think the answer is more concrete than a constitutional provision. The answer we find in our state legislatures, and the answer we find in Congress. People who are writing new laws, not the Constitution, writing new laws that criminalize almost everything. So even something like I would commend both of you to just go look at the driving manual, the handbook that tells you what's illegal with respect to driving. In Massachusetts, probably about this thick. We criminalize everything. We have more laws than criminal laws than anybody in the industrialized world. And because we do that, our incarceration rates are going to be high. So if you want to reduce the incarceration rates, then elect public officials who are more creative about solving problems, and those who don't rely on the criminal justice system to solve every social problem that we have. So I think that's the real problem, not the 13th Amendment, but it's the people that we send to the State House and to Congress who write these laws that just, again, criminalize almost everything.
On the topic of laws, recently, within the last week or so, we've seen two black men be executed. And although we don't have information, or I don't have specific information on one, I know one was 18 and he was simply an accomplice. If we could get your opinion on that, that would be great.
Yeah, so this is another area of the law where people of color are disproportionately impacted. That is, relative to population, black people and brown people are executed at higher rates than white people in America. And now the Supreme Court has told us in a famous case called McCleskey that you cannot use aggregate data of the sort that I just described to make a constitutional objection against capital punishment, but rather you have to look at each specific case. So here in let's deal with the case that you just spoke about, and I forget the gentleman's name right now. It's not on the forefront of my memory, but you're absolutely right that he was convicted not as the principal, that is, not as the person who pulled the trigger, who did the final act that caused the death, but as someone who aided in the process. And there was a lot of exculpatory evidence about whether this person actually knew what was going to happen. But put that aside for a second. In our society, the death penalty is supposed to be reserved for the most heinous acts possible, the people most culpable for the worst acts. And it's reserved for that because it's the ultimate punishment. And the finality of that punishment is such that you can't come back and fix it later, right? You execute somebody, that's it. You can't appeal it and bring them back from the dead. So we reserve that for the most egregious behavior. And when we start executing non-principals, people who are not the principal actors that cause the death, then we increase the likelihood that we're going to make mistakes that we simply cannot undo. And that runs contrary to the way in which the death penalty was designed to punish. I am not an advocate for the death penalty, period. I wish we would abolish it. But to the extent we have it, it really ought to be reserved for a very narrow class of case in which only the most egregious behavior is punished.
Do you know if our country uses the death penalty most often when convicting someone, or is that just like something we don't know?
Most often as compared to what? Other countries?
Yeah, other countries.
Yes. More than any country in the developed world, our numbers compare to countries like Iran and Afghanistan, and that is company you don't want to be in. So we're saying we put people to death on par with totalitarian countries, and that's not the sort of comparison I think that the USA wants to have.
What do you think, like, as we as like an American people and like as a government system, what do we need to do to change the prison system so it doesn't have certain aspects that remind us that reinstate slavery, I guess?
Vote, 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 vote. Again, the this happened because people vote in legislators who vote for the laws and who appoint the judges. So vote for the laws that make in an increasingly broad swath of conduct criminal, and the governors and the president who appoints judges. In some jurisdictions, judges run for office. So whether they run for office or appointed to office, who impose these sentences. Citizens who care about that have to vote for representatives who share their values and who will not only stop enlarging our criminal code, but will enact positive legislation that begins to reduce prison populations. So one of the things we know, and this is not a matter for debate, every competent criminologist and sociologist knows this, and no one in good faith will disagree that after a certain point in time in criminal sentences, anything longer has what the scholars call a criminogenic impact. Criminogenic is just a fancy word that means you get worse. So after a certain period of time in jail, the longer you stay, the worse you get. And we know this, and we're keeping people way beyond that point where any chance of rehabilitation gets outweighed by this criminogenic impact that comes with too long of an incarceration. We also know that over a certain age, the likelihood that people commits crimes drops precipitously. So like, 18 to 32, that's an age period where people are kind of in their heyday. But 64-year-old people just by and large aren't committing crimes, but we've got jails full of senior citizens who are in there and really ought not to be. We have a bunch, I think I said this at the beginning, of folks in there who need to have mental health assistance. That was the root cause of whatever that got them in jail. And then just hundreds of thousands of people who have serious substance abuse issues, and they need treatment, not jail. So we can do better, and the way to do better is to elect people who share your values, who will enact laws that will make this stuff come to pass.
Okay. In terms of like prison system and jail systems, we also talk a lot about bail. So what is your opinion about like the bail or the idea of it?
Well, our bail system money bail, at least, is in complete disarray at this point. We put people in jail because they can't afford to bail themselves out. So constitutionally, if a court sets bail, a bail is supposed to be set only to a point reasonably calculated to ensure the appearance of the person at trial. If a bail is set at an amount that a person cannot afford, the court constitutionally is required to reset that bail at an appropriate amount only to ensure that narrow value. But you have a lot of indigent people, a lot of poor people who, if you set bail at $100, you may as well set it at 1,000, 100,000, or 1,000,000 because they just don't have it. And we see this all over the country. And in fact, in an absolutely disgusting display that I saw circulating around Twitter just the other day, a judge doubles the bail from $1,000 to $2,000 because the judge got angry at the defendant. The defendant was saying yeah instead of yes, and the judge didn't understand that that's what the judge was trying to get her to say. But the judge got angry and increased the bail, doubled the bail, because the person was like, yeah, yeah, yeah. Completely unconstitutional, completely improper. But this bail system is just being used to imprison and warehouse people. And then here's what happens. So you're in jail, you got a bail you can't afford. Then a lawyer comes back to you and says, sir, if you tell me you're innocent, then we can set this for trial. Your trial will be in 3 months, right? So a person will be in jail for 3 months waiting on trial. Or you can go out there and tell the judge you're guilty, and the judge will send you home today. A lot of people choose the latter. They just say, look, I'd rather get out. I've got rent to pay. I got a car note to pay. I've got a child to feed. I can't lose my job. So I'll go and admit to whatever they're saying, get out of jail, and then go. And it all goes back to not being able to afford bail. Then what happens with that person if they get picked up for a couple more, technical violations? Now they're in a territory of what we call habitual offender, or 3 strikes you're out is kind of the colloquialism for it. And now they're facing serious time because of an initial bail decision in the first case where they pled to stuff that they didn't do. So it has a downstream effect. It has a downstream impact on the lives of people.
Do you think judges purposely set really high bails to keep people in prison and keep them in the system?
Yes, absolutely. They set really high bails, knowing that people cannot afford them. And that is deeply problematic and constitutionally offensive.
So, what do you think needs to be changed in terms of the bail system for it maybe to be more effective, I guess?
I think the presumption has to be on release with no money bail. I think that jurisdictions should abolish cash bail systems, and that judges should be required to be creative in finding a condition or set of conditions that reasonably ensures a person's presence. We have great GPS technology now. We can put ankle bracelets on people. They can have to call in every day to a probation officer or physically report every day, weekly drug testing. We do a lot of things to ensure that that people are present. And for very serious violent crime, murder, rape, etc., there are these things called preventive detention statutes, which means that you just don't get bail. You're preventively detained pending trial. So the most serious violent crime can be dealt with that way, but everything else you have to fashion some sort of non-monetary bail. That would be the best way and the fairest way, and data show the safest way as well.
Do you think youth prisons have any sort of direct or indirect relation with mass incarceration?
Yeah, I do. So it's interesting to use the term youth prison because that's unfortunately what a lot of them have become. It's supposed to be detention centers, and these are centers where people can go to school and that sort of thing. But they have become, Quentin, I think you're right, little prisons. And yes, that is part of the mass incarceration problem because what they're doing is just graduating people from the juvenile prison to the adult prison. That is, they're learning bad things inside of these juvenile prisons, and then they come out and immediately recidivate and end up in the adult prison system.
So your personal opinion, do you believe that prison for youth and adult, do you think it helps or hurts the people who go into it?
Well, it kind of goes back to what I said earlier. The data show that for some period of time, there can be a net positive good for certain people who can't seem to get along in civil society to be removed from society. Maybe they learn a skill, learn how to cut hair, learn welding, learn some sort of skill on the inside. Goes back to the days where rehabilitation used to be a value of the system, and it should be again, though the Supreme Court has said it is not. Uh, but um, but um, but after a certain time, there's this criminogenic impact, and net people are much worse off. They learn a host of bad values, and these are folk who are going to come back into the community again. So it seems to me that it's in all of our interests if to the extent we have prisons, to make those prisons a place where rehabilitation is a value, and we do the sorts of things so that when the wave of people come out of prison, then they are at least marginally ready to get along in society in a productive way.
Let me see here. I think I have one more. So before you had talked about the like sort of like judges and how a judge had doubled the bail just because he said yeah instead of yes. Do you think that police officers and judges in that sort of system like that, in the system that we have, do you think that they overuse their power in certain ways?
Sure. And look, I don't want to speak with too sweeping of a generalization. So we're talking about some judges and some police officers, not all judges and all police officers, but almost certainly you have both judges and police officers who abuse their authority, and particularly with respect to black and brown citizens, and that's the community. Those are the communities that my scholarship and work benefits the most. So you have uh, law enforcement that over polices in certain areas, and when you over police, then you tend to arrest more. And when you arrest more, you tend to produce more convictions. We also know from data that all things equal, people of color versus white people in America, judges sentence at differential rates. Black and brown people are sentenced longer. Uh, Black and brown people receive custodial, that means inside jail, custodial sentences at rates for the same crimes far greater than white Americans. And although white Americans, the Justice Department, Bureau of Justice Statistics tells us that white Americans use drugs at a rate greater than black Americans, but black Americans are overrepresented in jail for drugs. So even though we're 10 or 12% of the population, we're like 30 or 40% of people in jail for drugs, even though the white community uses drugs more than the black community, according to Department of Justice. So there are all sorts of unfairnesses that feel as though they're baked into the system, but it's really a function of the decisions that judges and police officers and prosecutors, you didn't ask about them yet, but that prosecutors make all the time. And that's how we have these skewed percentages.
Okay, I believe that's all the questions we have, unless you have another one, Robert.
No, I don't have another one.
Okay, then yeah, that's it.
All right, great. Good luck, guys. Thanks for asking me on.
Thank you.
All right, be well.
You too.